Okay. So we are on 10b. We finished 10b actually. And the Gemara that we learned yesterday, we spoke about the differences between the kinaifais and the kila and uh, and naklitin as well. And we mentioned what was the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel that you're allowed to sleep in a kila, even though there's a gag, but as long as it's not 10 tfachim. The Gemara asked some questions. Um, that you're not yotze if you sleep in this kila. And the Gemara said, well, if you're not yotze, that's not about a case. It's not 10 tefachim tall, but if it is 10 tefachim tall, that's when you're not yotze, but you don't fulfill the mitzvah. Then the Gemara talked about the Gemara brought a Mishnah. Yashin tachsamita, person sleeps under a bed. You don't fulfill the mitzvah. So l'chayra, you see, even if it's less than 10 tefachim, the Gemara says, no, that's the bed is 10 tefachim tall. That's why you don't fulfill the mitzvah. Then the Gemara brought our Mishnah, Pirs al-Gabi Kinoifais. So you see that it's puzzle if you put it on top of the Kinoifais. So you see that it should be Kila should also be puzzle. So the Gemara said that Kinoifis was not 10 tefachim. It was 10 tefachim tall. That's why it's not 10 handbreadths tall. That's why it's not yotze. The Gemara says you can't say that. So the Gemara ended off saying that there's a difference between kinoifos and kila. That when it talks about kinoifos, shani kinoifos the kviyi. The Gemara then says, "What do you mean sukkah gabi sukkah is kviyi?" And there we see you do need to attend to the 10 hand breath rule. So how could you tell me kinoifos is more kviyi? It's more the kinoifos is more sturdy, and therefore you don't need the 10 tfachim rule. We find sukkah gabe sukkah. It's of course an Indian of kvios there, and yet you do have the 10 tfachim rule according to Shmuel. So the Gemara says that there's a difference between making a sukkah puzzle or just saying that you're inside an oihel in a sukkah. In other words, where you're standing in the sukkah, you can't stand there, you can't lie there, you can't eat there. You're inside an oil in a sukkah. That's a problem. But you're not saying that the sukkah's puzzle. You want to say the sukkah's puzzle, then it would need to have 10 hand breaths to make the sukkah puzzle. So that was the Gemara's answer. Okay, then the final Gemara on page 10b was Rab Tachlifa bar Avimi in the name of Shmuel, that a person who sleeps naked inside a kila, so he needs to stick his head out in order to say Shema. And we mentioned yesterday that Tosfos over here says that there is a machlokes in the brachas about separating your heart from your private parts, which would mean that if you had some type of gartel, a belt, or if you're using your sheet cover, you would tighten it around your waist, and that would be considered a way of your heart not being exposed to your erva, to your nakedness, to your private parts. However, our Gemara is dealing only with your head being exposed, having your nakedness exposed to your mouth, to your head, and it's not dealing with your heart. And Tosfos says the reason is because Shmuel is not following that view that holds that your heart cannot see your erva. Did someone want to say something? I just
heard. Rabbi, isn't it like disrespectful to the sukkah to be naked in the sukkah?
No. He's not talking about sukkah anymore. He's inside some kila. This is his bed. We jumped to another case. He's saying Shema in his in his kila, and the thing is, there's a problem. You're naked. You can't say Shema. So can you stick your head out? So Rav Tachlifa bar Avimi says, yeah, stick your head out of the kila. And therefore, your mouth, you're saying words of holiness, is not exposed, is not it doesn't see your erva. Your erva is not exposed to the public. And the logic behind it is that that the kila is sort of like a garment, and it's considered like a garment that you're wearing this kila. So the Gemara asked the contradiction. It said, "What do you mean? Ayoshin bekila." There's a brisa that says person sleeps naked in a kila, so he can't just stick his head out of the kila and say Shema. So the Gemara answers that there's a difference between a kila that's 10 handbreadths tall and a kila that's less than 10 handbreadths tall. That if it's 10 handbreadths tall, then it's almost like a house. And it's like it's not considered a garment. So you can't say, so in other words, we would say that your head is where your body is. And therefore it's not like your head is outside of where your body is, because you go after the majority, and it wouldn't be a way of allowing you to say Shema in that type of circumstance. But if it's like a garment, then your head is outside of your garment, and basically your body is covered. Your body is covered. It's not a problem.
Rabbi,
Yes.
let's say somebody's standing in a murky lake. You can't see through the water, and he's standing is
Right.
that considered would be similar to this kind of
Yeah,
approach?
if I remember correctly, that was the case in the there's I have to look up the Mishnayos and Brachos. It's been a little while since I've reviewed it, but I think it does talk about if the difference between if it's clean water or dirty water, or colored water, that you can that it basically it covers you. So if I remember correctly, I have to take a look somewhere in the third chapter of Brachos over there. It's probably a Mishnah, probably says
But
it.
is this the same? In other words, the same logic behind this? Is that what we're talking about, or
Yeah, that you want to be
okay,
covered, right? That you can't
okay.
be exposed. Yeah, yeah. When you're saying a davar shebekdusha, v'lo yira b'cha ervas davar, and we understand it to mean dibur, that when you're speaking words of holiness, you can't see either. People shouldn't be able to see you exposed, or Hashem, you should be covered before Hashem. So that's the meaning of the pasuk. That applies when you're saying Shema, that you should be covered. And as we saw in Taisus, there is also a concept of covering, that your heart being separated from your erva, according to as the halacha. At least it doesn't follow this Gemara, but there is a halacha of such, that there's an argument in the Gemara or in the Mishnah, but the halacha follows that. Okay, so anyway, here the Gemara said that this fits well with the brisa, because that brisa actually says that compares sleeping naked and reciting Shema with your head outside of the kila, compares that to a house. If you're naked and you think you could just stick your head out of the house and say Shema, it doesn't work. And so the fact that it compares the two, it makes sense to say that it has to do with the fact that this is a full-fledged domain that's 10 tfachim. That's 10 handbreadths. However, the case that we said in the name of Shmuel, where Rav Tachlifa bar Ravimi said in the name of Shmuel that you could do that, that's where it's less than 10 handbreadths. If you look in the bottom, Rashi spells out what I said. The kivan delav oyelhu, since it's not an oyel, it's less than 10 handbreadths. Loyam rinon, we don't say lamakam sherubay sham roishay nizra. The place where your majority is, we throw your head there, meaning we consider your head to be in the place where the majority of your body is. And on the side, it has another word, nigrar, or nizrak is nigrar. It's pulled after, it's dragged to where the majority of your body is. And velitzar, and it would be usser, from the pasuk of mishum v'lo b'cha'er v'astavar, from this source of where it says that you shouldn't, your nakedness shouldn't be visible. Ella harehu kamaitzi roishay chutz l'chaluka. Rather, it is considered that he's extending his head outside of his garment. So that's the logic behind this statement in the name of Shmuel. Rav Tachlifa bar Avimi, in the name of Shmuel, says it's permissible. It's not 10 tfachim. It's allowed. The brisa is not a contradiction. The brisa was basically the brisa was talking about a case where it is 10 tfachim, and that's why it's prohibited. And that concludes 10b. And now we turn to 11a. 11a, the top of the page. Now, Ubayis Nami, in the house also, Afal P, even though Shein Gavaya Sarah, that even if a house is not 10 handbreadths tall, Kivan de Kavia, since it is set, it's permanent, Oyalahu, it is considered an oyel, a tent, even if it's not 10 handbreadths tall. And we will say that your head is dragged after your body, and we consider it to be in the same location, that in other words, that everything, your head is also inside the house, and you would not be allowed to say Kriya Shema while your head is stuck out if the house, even if the house is less than 10 handbreadths. Because it's no worse than the case where we said that kinoifos are kavua, it is a set, it is permanent. And even if kinoifos is not 10 handbreadths tall, it is considered like an oyhel regarding sukkah. The same law applies regarding Kriya Shema. So again, if you remember that we said that kinoifos was a problem even if it's less than 10 handbreadths, and we said the reason is because it's kviyi, and since it's kviyi, it doesn't, even less than 10 handbreadths was a problem. And we said to passel a sukkah, you would need it to be 10 handbreadths, but to be considered a tent, that was the fact that it's kviyi makes it different than kila. And kila, if it's less than 10 handbreadths, would not be a problem. But kinoifos, 10 hand, even less than 10 handbreadths, would be a problem for a sukkah. And here the Gemara says, bias, a house that's less than 10 handbreadths, would be just like kinoifos regarding Kriya Shema. That because it's kviyi, because it's sort of like a permanent type of structure, so it's kviyi, and therefore you wouldn't be able to say, this is my garment. I'm sticking my head outside of my head is just popping out of my garment. You wouldn't be able to say that. And the same thing would apply to a house as to kinoifos.
Rabbi?
Now, yes.
Is the purpose of this basically so that a person should not make it a regular thing to stick their head out of a permanent structure, or to make this a regular thing? It should only be done only in a temporary dwelling, in other words. I mean, is this the essence of this whole?
What's the other option? The essence is what?
In other words, the essence is that it should only be done in a temporary dwelling and not in a permanent dwelling where people are constantly sticking their head out to separate themselves from their body, to say the Kriyat Shema. I mean, this is what I'm trying to figure out from this.
Well, the point is, of course, that this is one way is allowed, one way isn't. And the reason for that has to do with, could we consider it a garment or not? When you're sticking your head out, we say, oh, that's like your garment, and you now stuck your head out of your garment, just like your shirt, your head sticks out of your shirt, and your body is covered with your garment, and we don't have a problem. So the same thing would apply to the kila. But the question is, how far can we extend that? Can that apply to a house? And the answer is no, can't apply to a house. Now, Rashi tells us that, don't think this is the Brisa saying that. This is the Gemara saying that. Rashi makes it like puts a little emphasis on that. Hach milsa shmaitza ba'ape nafshi. Nafsha. It's an entity of its own. That we shouldn't think that a house is like a kila if it's not 10 tefachim high, and you would be allowed to. No, you can't do that. And so that's the Gemara expounding on the previous brisa. And the Gemara now brings another girsa, another version of Shmuel's din about a kila. And the way the Gemara understand the new point, the new version, is that Shmuel is not talking about a regular kila. He's talking about something called a kilas chasanim.
Rabbi, how are you translating kila again?
A kila was some type of canopy that was less permanent than a kinoifis, than a real canopy. This was like a temporary canopy, but we understood it, kila, to be flat on the top. Now we're going to say kilas chasanim, that Shmuel's talking about a case of kilas chasanim, which is more like the naklitin, which was a one pole at the head, one pole at the feet, and it doesn't have a roof on the top that's flat. It has a diagonal roof, and so it's similar in halacha to naklitin, at least in the sense that it doesn't have a roof. So the Gemara says lishna. It's not exactly like naklitin. That's I just want to emphasize, but it's similar in its structure to naklitin, because it basically has that two poles, one at the head, one at the feet, and it's draped over it, over that beam that attaches these two poles, and draped over it with a diagonal, like a triangular shape. So the Gemara says, Lishna Achrina, another Lashon Amri La. They say this. That Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, that Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Mutar Lisha B'kilas Chasanim B'sukkah B'shein Lagag. You're allowed to sleep in a kilas chasanim. That's again this type of structure that's like a triangle that's draped over it. And the reason is because it doesn't have a gag, it doesn't have a roof, and therefore you're not considered to be dwelling inside a tent. Instead, we look at the big picture. You're dwelling in a sukkah. Afal pi shagavaya asara, even though it is 10 handbreadths tall. Now, 10 handbreadths tall, we know that a naklitin, if it's 10 handbreadths tall, you can't sleep in it. So why could you sleep in a kilos chasanim? Right? It sounds very similar to naklitin. But naklitin doesn't work if it's 10 handbreadths tall, but kilos chasanim is going to work. So let's see the Gemara. Meisvei, the Bnei Yeshiva asked the question, asked the contradiction. There's a brisa. It says you sleep inside a kila, in a sukkah. You are not yoitza. You don't fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah. You're inside a kila. You're sleeping in this kila. You're not yoitza. And the Gemara's understanding that it would apply whether the kila has a roof or doesn't have a roof. And seemingly this should apply here, that you're not yoitza, you're inside a kila. So the Gemara answers, we're talking about the Bryce. It says you're not fulfilling the mitzvahs because it has a roof. But if it doesn't have a roof, then it would be okay. Kilas chasanim, that doesn't have a flat roof, it has a slanted roof, that would not be a problem. because it doesn't have that hand breadth of flatness on the top that makes it called a oyhel. So that is the answer to that brisa. That's not a contradiction. Kilas chasanim doesn't have a roof. It's okay. Regular kila would be a problem. Toshima coming here. They asked another question on this new understanding of the words of Shmuel, Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. Toshima coming here. Nakliten shnayim. Nakliten means that you have two poles that are standing upright, one at the head, one at the feet, and you have a beam attached between these two poles, and you have the sheet on top of it. That's what naklitin is. The triangular, the sheet is shaped as in a slanted fashion. Kinoifais are but the kinoifais, they're full 4 poles. So that would mean that the roof of it is going to be flat. Pires al gabe kinoifais, if you spread the sheet on top of the kinoifais, psula, it is going to be invalid. Agabe naklitin kshera, on top of naklitin, it's kosher. As long as the naklitin are not high from the bed, 10 handbreadths. So you see that, one second, what did I just read? As long as the naklitin are not gvayim menamita asar tvachim. As long as the naklitin are not 10 handbreadths tall from the bed. But if they would be 10 handbreadths, if the naklitin, the size of the naklitin is that the roof will be 10 handbreadths above the bed, even if it doesn't have a roof, you wouldn't be allowed to sleep under it. So how does this work with the kilas chasanim? Kilas chasanim, we said you're allowed to sleep under, even if it's 10 handbreadths. The brisa says kinoifais, you cannot naklitin, you can't sleep under, and it's talking about a case. It says you could sleep under it if it's less than 10 handbreadths, which means that you can't sleep under it if it's 10 handbreadths. So kilas chasan, we said even 10 handbreadths is fine. Naklitin, we said no, if it's 10 handbreadths, it's not fine. Then we're into shani naklitin the kviyi. Naklitin are considered more permanent, and therefore they are considered an oyel. You're dwelling in the naklitin. Even though there's no flat roof. It's considered that it's you're dwelling in some separate entity. As long as it's 10 handbreadths. But kilas chasanim, it's so temporary, it's not attached. So therefore, you would be allowed to sleep under it, even if it's 10 handbreadths tall. Of course, we're talking about it doesn't have a gag, it doesn't have a roof, and therefore it's allowed. So it's not glitin, we're more machmir because it's kviyi, it's more permanent. And even though it doesn't have a roof, but since it's 10 handbreadths, we're going to say that it's a problem to sleep under. So the Gemara says, I kviyi leve kikinoifais. If it's kavua, then let it have, kinoifais, we said, the canopy, that even if it's not 10 handbreadths, you're not allowed to sleep under it. So you're telling me that that naklitin is kavua, so it should have the same laws kinoifais, even less than 10 handbreadths. Our answer is no. Gabi kinoifais is like kvi. Relative to kinoifais, this is not called permanent, and therefore there's a difference between that kinoifais, we don't care if it's 10 handbreadths or not, but regarding but naklitin, we do care if there's 10 handbreadths or not, because it's not as permanent as kinoifais. Lagabe kila, relative to kila, it is kviyi, naklitin is kviyi, and therefore, since it's kviyin, it's attached. So therefore, if it's 10 handbreadths we don't allow you to sleep under it. But kilas chasanim, even if it's 10 hand breaths, we will allow you to sleep under it. So that's basically the Gemara's discussion about the having an oihel inside your sukkah. Now, that followed the understanding that you're not that it's a problem. If it's considered an oihel, then it's definitely a problem. And even things that are quasi oihels, we also considered a problem. Now comes another view. Darash Rabba bar Rav Huna muter lishan bekila. Here comes Rabba bar Rav Huna that, you know what, you're allowed to sleep in a kila. And we're not talking about a kilas chasanim. We're talking about a regular kila, according to Rashi. Now, according to Taisvis, he says that we're talking about a kilas chasanim. Okay. But it's the Taisus over here, the second Taisus. Kilas chasanim. Anyway, the on the side I see they take off from Taisus's Girsa, the Kilas chasanim. There's a side on the side, it removes it, but it seems that that's the opinion of Taisus, that's the wording of the Gemara. In any event, the simple reading is mutter lishan bekila, even if it has a gag, even if it has 10 hand breaths. And who does this go like? Come on, who can this go like? We you got all the problems. It's flat roof, that's a problem. It's oil. It's 10 hand breaths, that's a problem. That's a real oil. And you're inside a sukkah, and you're going to fulfill the mitzvah. How are you fulfilling the mitzvah? So the Gemara asks, come on, who can this go like? The Gemara says, Reb Yehuda. This fits with Reb Yehuda. Damar lo yasi oyel arayim vata lo oyel keva. Reb Yehuda says in a Mishnah later on that when you have a oyel aray temporary tent, it doesn't ruin the oyel keva, the permanent tent, which is the sukkah, meaning you're dwelling inside a big sukkah that's surrounding, but inside it there's this oyel aray, there's this tent. We don't consider the tent significant. So you're inside the tent, yeah, but that's not significant. You're inside the sukkah. That's the main thing. So he holds that an oyel aray doesn't ruin the oyel keva. And if you have a temporary tent inside a sukkah, the sukkah is what we look at, and the temporary tent is considered insignificant. What's the case? Where's the Mishnah? So it says Ditnan, because we learned in a Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, Noyagin hayinu lishan tachas amita b'fnei hazakenim. We would sleep under a bed in front of the elders, and they didn't tell us anything. Why? Because the bed is considered like a temporary dwelling. It seems that in those days they would move around the beds, and it's not going to ruin the oyel keva, the permanent tent of the sukkah. And so it sounds like this is the view of Reb Yehuda, that you could sleep under, if he says you can sleep under a bed, seemingly this is the logic that because an oyel aray doesn't ruin an oyel keva, and the same thing would apply to a kila, that even if it has 10 tvachim and it has this flat roof, it's not a problem. It's an oyel aray. Compared to a sukkah, it's insignificant. So the Gemara says, why don't we just say the halachas like Rabbi Yehuda? Why does he pick a case of mutalisha bekila? Should just say it's halachas like Rabbi Yehuda, that oyel aray versus oyel keva isn't a fight, and the oyel keva wins. And so why does he just say halachas like Rabbi Yehuda? In other words, it's not his view. You're not really. This is not your view. You're really following Rabbi Yehuda. So he says, no, you can't say halacha Rabbi Yehuda. Yamar Halacha Rabbi Yehuda. I mean, I would think if it said the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, I would think Hanimile Mita, that applies only to a bed. Why? Delagaba Asuya, that it's meant for on top of it. It's meant for sleeping on top of it. And it's not meant to be an oil, meaning you're sleeping under it. But the bed, the point of the bed is not meant to be an oil under it, and therefore you want to sleep under it. We're not going to call that an oil. Aval kila, but a kila delateicha asuya, that it's meant for what's inside it. It's meant to sleep in it. It should be considered an oil. So aim Allah, I would think that wouldn't be acceptable according to Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda would not permit such a thing inside a sukkah, and it would be called an oil, and it would not be considered like you're dwelling in the sukkah or sleeping in the sukkah. It's considered like you're dwelling in the oil. Kamash Bala, and it comes and lets us hear Rabba Bar Rav Huna that what? Taima de Rabbi Yehuda, the reason of Rabbi Yehuda is the reason, his reason fits over here as well. That what's his reason? That it's all about oil aray versus oil keva. The temporary tent does not come and ruin the oil keva. It wouldn't make a difference if it's a bed. It wouldn't make a difference if it's a kila, this type of canopy. The oil arai never ruins the oil keva, and therefore the din is you could sleep under them and not have any problem. So that's basically this Gemara. We've concluded this oil discussion, and now the Gemara talks about the schach. And a special law regarding the schach that we're going to see. What does the schach have to be made from? And also a concept of tasa v'loimin ha'asui, that do you need to actually place the schach on top, or is it good enough if you just make the schach kosher and it was already placed there? So let's...
Rabbi,
Yes.
so in the last part, we're basically saying it's not acceptable to sleep in a kila except if you follow Rabbi Yehuda's
Right.
point of view.
Well,
But it's not halacha.
Well, that's what it said. That's what it seems like, that he's following this individual view of Rabbi Yehuda, but even Rabbi Yehuda's view is unclear, and the reasoning behind it, and he expounds on the reasoning, and basically it ends up being that it's that the logic behind it will work for a kila. In other words, it will be the same logic under a bed as under a kila. Anyway, that's the case. But however, I should just clarify that the kila that's less than 10 hand breaths seems to be acceptable. It was the kila that was more than 10 hand breaths that's a problem, right? If you remember from the previous Gemara, and again, not today's Gemara, but yesterday's Gemara, where we had Yashin Bekila, that Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, that he said, Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Mutar Lisha Bekila B'Sukkah, even though she yesh lagag, as long as it's not 10 hand breaths. So that's if you want to know if the halacha follows that, I guess we could look it up. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Mutar Lisha Bekila, and that is in chapter 627. Sif days, 1 second. And Just 1 second. That's in page. Yoshin tach sakila b'sukkah meina gavaya sort tfachim karkoim shein lo gag rochav tefach is yoytze. You are yoytze if it's not 10 handbreadths. Now, I do have to see one thing over there because it does say from the ground, and that seemingly that means from the bed. What does it mean from the ground? Yeah, karka. Oh, the case is that because the bed is on the ground, so therefore you count from the ground. But the kilos, it's the 4 poles. Interesting. That's changing the case a little. The case that the way they explain the case is that the kilo is the 4 poles are actually extending from the ground, and the bed is right on the ground.
So there's no space underneath the bed.
That's what it sounds like. 1 second, let me make sure I'm saying this right. I know shakilo imedes al gabi arba amudim shoimdim al karka. Lachim kol zvapetim shezvach medim me'akarka l'dem me'amita. It's like an agul v'neu shemedim zezvach me'amita mishum shem mechubarim l'mita. So the poles doesn't really say if the bed where the bed is, but it seems because the poles are on the ground, in other words, the other ones are attached to the bed. Here, the poles are not attached to the bed; they're attached to the ground. So we count it from the ground. That's where the tent is basically extends to the ground. So okay, well that's interesting to a little addition to this point. I see there's a big discussion here. There is a big discussion here.
Rabbi?
There's a big discussion here regarding what about if the roof within 3 tfachim of the top tip of the roof, does it reach a width of a handbreadth? In other words, how narrow is the top of this type of canopy? Because the law of Lavud could make that we would consider that even though it's not flat, but instead it's slanted, but because within 3 tfachim of the top, there is a width of 3 handbreadth within 3 handbreadths from the top, there is a width of 1 handbreadth. So we would call that lavud and consider that the roof and say, listen, you have a flat roof over here. So that's what seems to be a discussion about.
So that would be the angle. The angle would be like a geometry problem.
You'd have to make it very narrow.
Rabbi?
This is he brings from the Aguda. Okay. Yeah. Moshe, did you
Can
want to
a
say
chatuna, a wedding, I think it is, can that be held with a canopy inside a sukkah?
Not really sure to what extent we're machmir to have it. You know what I mean? Under the sky, under the stars. Is it good enough if there's a small little, like how big of a space do you need in order to be considered kosher for a chuppah? Like there are halls that they have, like if it's raining, they do it inside and they have a little like window on the roof that they open up. I'm not sure what the measurement of that window has to be. Maybe so I guess we could look it up how machmir we are. It's obviously not can't be a halacha because like there's many weddings that they do inside without not a, like second marriages they do inside. There must be a minhag, to do it outside, tradition that we do it outside. But you're wondering inside a sukkah if how much airspace I would guess it probably wouldn't work inside a sukkah because they probably do want to have like 3 handbreadths by 3 handbreadths. I don't know. I'd have to look up the law of the in the minhagim, all the svarim that talk about the minhagim of weddings probably would mention it. But I don't believe it's a halacha. I believe it's more like a minhag. So it wouldn't invalidate the wedding if it was inside a sukkah. Okay. Anyway,
Oh, can you even get married on sukkahs?
Oh, that's an interesting, right? But what about if it's not sukkahs and you just have your sukkah up? If you have your sukkahs, right? No, that's a good point. You're not. We don't do weddings on Yom Tovim, but even on Chol Hamoed. But the thing is, your sukkah could still be up afterwards.
Yeah,
so
that's right. That's what we know.
it could have applicability after sukkahs or before
Well,
sukkahs if you
question.
put up your sukkah. Yes.
When I know the tradition of Chabad is to get married under the stars. Is that from Yitzchok and Rivka, where it says, he took her and then he brought her into the tent?
Right, into the tent. I'm not exactly sure what the origin is. I have to look it up unless someone else here knows. Does anyone, maybe Bezalel, David, anyone have any, Isaac, anyone have any insight into that about the chuppah being outside?
Me, no.
All right. We'll have to look it up and see where what the source is. So getting back to our Gemara here, where are we up to? We're on page 11. 11a, the Mishnah. That's where we are. Okay. So let's begin the Mishnah. Hidla Aleha. If he pulled on, he lifted up, I should say, onto the sukkah, es hagefen, the vine, which is attached to the ground, ve'es hadalas, in the gourd, ve'es hakisos, and some type of grass that grows very big. I don't know if you have a translation.
It calls it ivy in the
Ivy. Okay, you translate it as ivy over there. Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
So he pulled it on top of his sukkah, v'sigach al gaba, and he put some schach on top of this. Psula, it is puzzle, and the reason is because your schach is, even though it grows from the ground, sounds like it should work. The grapevine should be okay, and but nevertheless, it's attached to the ground, and because it's attached to the ground, it is going to be invalid puzzle. So it's schach kosher, but it's attached to the ground. Now, v'im sikoch, v'im haya sikoch harbe mehen, if you had much more schach than the things that are attached to the ground, oy shekatzatzon, or you cut them, you cut this the schach that's attached to the ground, sheira, it will be kosher. Zahaklal, this is the rule. Kol shubakabel tuma, anything that is a recipient of tuma can receive tuma. Ve'ein gidulei min haaretz, or it doesn't grow from the ground. So, in other words, if it's makabel tuma, that's one problem. Or even if it's not makabel tuma, but it doesn't grow from the ground, that would be another problem. And ein masachim, but you can't use for schach. And anything that is not makabel tuma, And now we have to say, and it also grows from the ground. Sometimes vav could mean or, sometimes it means and. Here it means and. You need both. You need it to be, number one, it's not makabel tuma. Number two, it grows from the ground. Mesachim boy, then you could use for schach. Now, the Gemara says, Yosef Rav Yosef kamed Rav Huna. Rav Yosef was sitting in front of Rav Huna. But Yosef ka'amar, and he was sitting, and he said, Oishek tzatzon kashera, that if he cut the branches that are attached to the ground after he already pulled them onto his sukkah, so he has the schach, that's it physically, in essence, it's kosher for schach. However, the problem is it's attached to the ground. So what happens if he cuts it? Then it's kosher. But Amar Rav said, Tzarech l'na'neya, you need to shake the schach after you cut it. That it's not enough just to cut it, but you would need to shake it. And the understanding is you need to lift up each branch alone, and then and after all the branch, then you lift up each branch, then it would be kosher. And the meaning behind this is that if you just cut it, it would be a problem of taseh v'lo min ha'asui. What does this mean? That it says sukkahs you should make for yourself. We darshan sukkahs taseh. It says in the pasuk chag hasukkahs taseh l'cha. We take those two words sukkahs taseh, that a sukkah you should make. And not that it's a puzzle sukkah and you fixed it and now it becomes kosher, but rather when you make it, it should be kosher. Now, if you have a non-kosher schach, or I should say you have schach that's attached to the ground, so the sukkah is not a proper sukkah. And now what are you doing? All you're doing is cutting the branches. So that would not be considered that you made the sukkah, you made a kosher sukkah. No, you actually made a non-kosher sukkah, and now you fixed it. That's not considered sukkahs taseh. Sukkahs taseh means you should make the sukkah. Here, it's not considered that you made a kosher sukkah. It's considered that you built a non-kosher sukkah, and now you did something to fix it, and now it's sukkah made on its own, so to speak. It becomes kosher, but you didn't make it. But it says sukkahs taseh, you were supposed to make it. So therefore, you would need to make the sukkah by lifting up each of the branches, and that would be considered that you are making the sukkah kosher. You are making a kosher sukkah. So that's the understanding of this statement. Now, who said this statement? Rabbi Yosef said this statement, and he quoted the Mishnah, and then he said that Rav said this point in addition on the Mishnah. So Rav Huna, Rav Huna was sitting there listening to Rabbi Yosef, and he said, Hashmuel Amra. Shmuel said this din about lifting up each piece, shaking it. Literally means shaking it. But Shmuel said this din, not Rav. Nadrina Rav Yosef la pei. So Rav Yosef turned his face to Rav Huna, and Amar Le said to him, Atu mika minalach, delay Amar Shmuel. Did I tell you that Shmuel didn't say this? What do you tell me? Shmuel said this. Did I tell you he didn't? Shmuel maybe also said it. I don't know. But Amra Rav, Amar Shmuel. So Rav said it and Shmuel said it. It makes sense. It's Torah. This is the halacha. So it's not surprising if Shmuel also said it. So why are you answering me back that, Shmuel said it? I'm quoting Rav. Shmuel said it? Okay, so maybe Shmuel, I didn't tell you that Shmuel didn't say it. So he's sort of angry at Rav Huna for telling. So Amar Le Rav Huna says back to him, this is what I mean to tell you. The Shmuel Amra V'loi Rav. Shmuel said this But Rav doesn't say this. Rav actually argues on this. And that's what I mean to tell you, that you're saying in the name of Rav, but Rav, I don't mean to tell you that Shmuel said this and you should have mentioned Shmuel. I mean to tell you that this is Shmuel Shita, but Rav argues on it. And you quoted it in the name of Rav, but Rav doesn't agree with this. Rav actually argues. The Rav Achshurei Machshir, Rav holds that this sukkah is kosher even without shaking the schach. Because when you cut it, he holds that's considered making the sukkah kosher. You're cutting it, you're making it kosher. So what would be a case according to Rav that you can't do this? So Rashi is bothered with that. How do you have tasav limana also according to Rav? Every time you have that you make it, it's not kosher, and you fix something, you make it kosher. Seemingly, that would be a kosher according to Rav. So when you have a case that's called tasav limana also, that you have to make it and you can't just have it made because you fix something and now it's automatically made, it's considered kosher. How could you have such a case? So Rashi is bothered with this question. If you look in Rashi, Achshurei Machshir Beloy Nianua, he koshers it without shaking it. And it seems that Rashi has those two words in his version of the Gemara, Beloy Nianua. And our Gemara doesn't actually have those words, but it seems that Rashi in his Girsa, his version, actually had those two words. It's the same meaning. Achshurei Machshir Beloy Nianua, it's kosher even if you don't go and fix it. And Rashi says the Kasavar, he holds Tsisasan Zuhi Gemara Siyasan, when you cut it, that is called making it. That's the conclusion of making it. So how is it possible to have tasav lemon that you would make it and that you didn't fulfill the way a sukkah is supposed to be done properly, because it was minha also, it ended up being made, but you didn't make it. How do you have such a case? According to Rav, every time you fix it, you're considered making it. According to Shmuel, when you fix it, it's not considered making it. And therefore, you didn't make a kosher sukkah. You made a puzzle sukkah. You fixed something, and now it's kosher on its own, and you didn't make it. And therefore, you got to go and be menanea. You got to go and lift up all of the leaves, each one individually, at least according to one understanding of this. Now, according to Rav, you don't have to do that. Why not? Because you made a non-kosher sukkah, true, but you didn't finish it. And now when you cut the leaves, or you cut the branches off from their attachment to the ground, now you have made a kosher sukkah. It's tasa. You've made a sukkah. It says you should make it. I just made it. It's not considered it was made. I cut it, so that's called making it. According to Rav, that's good enough. If you cut it, I made the sukkah. So cutting it is considered an act of building it, and it's considered of making a kosher sukkah. I now made a kosher sukkah. Tasa. But how does he darshan? Also, you can't have it that it was made automatically. What would be the case, according to him, that it was done and it wasn't that I made it? So Rashi says, Kagoyin, for example, a chaytit begadish, someone who digs into the gadish, into the pile of grain, la'ases loy sukkah, to make a sukkah. So he digs himself in over there and makes a 10 handbreadth height of empty space. And shasika chaya me'elav, the schach came on its own. I'm not even touching it. Not even touching. I'm not even cutting it. I'm just making a hollow area to dwell in. So I'm removing one of the walls and entering into its depth, and I'm pulling out the bundles and throwing them away. Now the walls I didn't make, and I didn't make the schach. The walls and the schach are here. I just dug a hole inside to make a hollow. This that I'm cutting, this is its action that it was done, concluded with hechsher. So that's the understanding, that according to Rav, that it would be okay even if you don't lift up the schach.